Good evening. My name's Tom Giroux, and I'm with the Forest History Association of Wisconsin. A little bit of information about the Forest History Association you can see on your screen right now. Our mission is to inform, educate, archive, and publish. And of course, these webinar series that we do every month are part of our Inform and Educate. Just to let you know, this does cost us some money. We have to have a Zoom subscription capable of broadcasting to 500 people. And then we offer an honorarium to our speakers, which is often donated to a local history association. So it's our way of saying thanks for the presentations that we give. So if you support our mission and want to support our efforts to provide this kind of programming, I'd encourage you to become a member of the Forest History Association of Wisconsin. And you can do so by going to the link on the screen there, or just search for the Forest History Association of Wisconsin, and you can sign up and pay online. So I'm going to turn it over to my coworkers, Don Schnitzler and Becky Gaskill. Don.
Okay, as Tom said, I'm Don Schnitzler. I'm also a member of the Board of Directors for the Forest History Association, and I'm pleased to welcome everyone to our final 2024 webinar. This will be the last one for this year, and we're working on scheduling the events for next year. To help make tonight's presentation a successful experience for everyone, we're asking that you pose or hold questions or pose questions using the chat feature, which is probably located at the bottom of your screen. We will hold those till the end of her presentation, at which time Becky, Tom, or I will relay the questions to her. If you're new to Zoom or you have any challenges with the system during the presentation, you can use that same chat feature to reach out to Tom or me, and we'll see if we can help you from our end. And then finally, be aware that at the end of the webinar tonight, you'll receive a brief survey, 8 questions, that we use to help plan future events or assess how this one went. And so we'd appreciate you taking just a few moments to fill that survey in. This evening's presentation is titled Opening the Door, the Ghost Ports of Door County. Door County is renowned for its scenic and stunning coastlines. In the 19th century, what would become Wisconsin's tourist playground was the scene of a bustling timber industry, with nearly 70 ports exporting timber, stone, and other goods. Most of these small ports have vanished into history, but some have left surprising echoes behind. With this presentation, you can hear the story of how Door County became Door County and how you can visit these ghost ports. Our speaker tonight is Dr. Amy Rosebrough. She is with the Wisconsin State Archaeologist. She is the Wisconsin State Archaeologist with the Office of State Archaeology at the Wisconsin Historical Society. We're all looking forward to hearing Dr. Rosebrough, and so let me turn it over to her for this evening's presentation. Amy?
Let's double check that you all can see the screen.
Can do.
Can do. All right. Okay, awesome. Well, hello, everyone. I want to thank you for the invitation to speak to the group. So you guys are officially my last presentation of the year, and I'm very happy that we're going to kind of wrap things up with our lost coastal communities. This is a project that's been very dear to our hearts. And the Door County sections of the study, just phenomenal. One of my favorite places in Wisconsin, Door County. So how did all this get started? Well, the Wisconsin Historical Society, interest in Wisconsin ghost ports was born with a request from the family of Nicholas and Paul Ronk, and they were owners of the Luxemburger Pier Company. You see the two men sitting here in the foreground on this pier. The descendants asked for our help in finding a place called Ronksville. And a little confusing to us. You don't see Ronksville on any maps today. It's just not there. We knew it was listed on enrollment documents as the home port of the schooner Northerner, which carried cordwood and other timber products in the 1800s, but not much more than that. It was a lost community. The family lore held that the two brothers built a large pier on their lakeshore land in the mid 1800s because they thought it took too long to import goods from Milwaukee overland or from Port Washington to a tavern and a hotel they owned in the little community of Lake Church inland. Ronksville was then presumably located where their properties were. We were able to find that. We found a deed that mentioned a road going to Luxembourger Pier Company land. And we initiated a survey to try and find remains of the pier, which we were able to do. Okay. As we continued with our research, though, we kept finding references to other little towns and villages that don't exist anymore. Yorkville, Nordheim, Centerville, Lindsville, Blakesville. Again, these places do not appear on any maps today, and we realized that there was a larger story waiting to be told out there. We have since discovered, through archival sources or archaeologically, almost 100 of these little ports up and down the Lake Michigan coast, and 70 of them, we don't show all of them here on this map, but 70 of them are located in Door County. So this was the epicenter of lumber shipping along the rural coastlines. So between the surveys and our archival research, we're starting to bring some of these communities back to life. These lonely stretches of beach and quiet boat launches used to be very, very bustling places where people worked and rejoiced and mourned and struggled to make a living and make their lives. So you walk along the beach today, you get no hint of that, but a little bit of research and a little bit of diving, and you can go back in time to the days when the lake was just absolutely ruled by the lumber schooners and the passenger and merchandise steamers that came to visit these ports. Each of these ports tells a different story, and the stories and the bigger history that they tell have been overlooked for way, way too long. These little rural pier communities and the people who worked there changed Wisconsin, and they changed the Midwest. So the bigger story starts in the 1840s and 1850s, when the Ho-Chunk, Menominee, and Anishinaabe peoples of eastern Wisconsin were forced to sign agreements to move westward and open up Wisconsin's coastline to colonization and settlement. Not all left. Many Anishinaabe communities, in particular, remained in small settlements and villages along the shores of Kewaunee and Door County near their traditional fishing grounds. They came to the coast seasonally, as they had done since time immemorial. The dugout canoes, though, were joined by new ships, Mackinaw boats, lumber schooners, and steamers, and moving up the lake in search of raw materials and land. So between those years, Wisconsin's shoreline went an absolutely seismic transformation, and the piers were the engines that made that transformation happen. Wisconsin's natural resources, its coastal forests, its bedrock, its fish, its clay deposits, and its soil were in high demand. To the south and the east, the cities of Milwaukee and Chicago were growing up, and they needed raw materials. People were moving out and colonizing the plain states, the prairie areas where there wasn't much timber. They needed a way to build houses, to put up fences, telegraph lines, railroads. And they turned to Wisconsin, its coastal forest. So kind of in green here, you see the extent of coastal forest as it was in the 1850s. And in just a decade or two, things started to change. And today, very little of that forest is left. It's very open. It's a very agricultural European landscape. Again, these ports made that happen. Most along the southern part of the coastline at Ronksville, where we began, the people that came and built these little export facilities were mostly looking for cordwood. And they're working in a hardwood area where there's maple and oak, and so they're kind of chopping things up so they could ship it out for fuel. So here we have some happy cordwood carriers with a team of oxen there, and they're selling not just locally, but to passing ships. So the steamers moving on, this is before coal-fired steam boilers. They wanted wood to fire the boilers, and a single trip from one end of the Great Lakes to the other could eat up 20 acres of forest. That's one trip. So you needed a lot of wood. The port facilities then were sort of set up to facilitate that. Advertisements were put out to the captains saying, stop at this pier, you can resupply with us. They'd put up a general store. Not just people could come ashore and maybe they needed, they ripped their shirt or they needed some new tableware or they were out of molasses. They come resupply and then head back out on the lake. They were also supplying incoming settlers that would arrive at the pier and head inland for their new homesteads to set up farms. And they were employing some of those farmers in the off season. A couple of advertisements here, both from Door County and from down southern Racine County. Come chop for us. We'll pay you, or we'll give you credit in the store. We'll give you housing. Come work for us. So you can kind of think of these little communities as the quick trips of their day. They were selling, gas in the form of fuel to ships passing by. And like a convenience store, they were selling other things too. Stop in, get your sundries, and then head back along your way. The piers made that happen. Lake Michigan's coast, the shallows extend out quite far from shore, so you can't bring a schooner right up to the coastline to the forest unless you're at a natural harbor. So Kewaunee, Manitowoc, Sheboygan are where they are because that's where rivers enter the lake and that's where the natural harbors form. Everywhere else, there's hundreds of feet of shallow water in the way. So the piers are built to kind of solve that problem. They're extended out on the lake, sometimes a few hundred feet, sometimes up to 2,000 feet out, as far as you need to get to safe water. And almost every one of the pier builders wound up making their piers longer after the first year. They'd get it out and what they thought, okay, this is safe. And then the first storm would roll by and you realize, oops, yeah, maybe not as safe as we thought there. So many of these piers have a shipwreck or two associated with them. And all of them had multiple ships ground and go ashore and bang, into the pier siding and be rescued later. In the southern part of the coastline, some of these little communities switched very quickly. They ran out of coastal forest. There wasn't much there to begin with. They shipped out all the hardwood and they pivoted very quickly to agricultural products in a few of them. So this is Amsterdam. Another, again, there's not a or sorry, not Amsterdam. This is Centerville. Modern Hika stands at this location today, near Cleveland, Wisconsin. A decent little town sprang up, and the kind of economic heart of this one, see on the far left of the photo, with the smokestacks and chimneys going up, was a brewery. So, good Wisconsinites, they were shipping out beer after the trees were gone. Once you get north into Door County, however, soil's not that great. You can ship some agricultural product, but there's not as much farming up there. There's a lot of bedrock close to the surface, though, so building stone, highly in demand, stuff that can be burned down the line. And then, of course, you've got the pine and the hemlock and the cedar of the northern forest, very much in demand. So people would set up on the coast. They'd try and find a little creek or a stream if they could, or maybe a natural sheltered area in a bay, and they'd set up little communities. So this is just sort of a kind of an idealized version. You see the pier going out on the lake, you see roads going to the pier and then inland into the pinery and the logging areas. And then there you'd find your sawmill, often warehouses and support buildings, the general store. Of course, you've got to have a place for people to sleep and stay, so there'd be a boarding house. And some workers brought families, so there'd be small farms and cabins scattered about. You have to have a blacksmith, obviously. And then every so often, if the population got big enough, you'd have some enterprising individual who would set up a tavern, a dance hall, or a hotel nearby, kind of capture some of that money. And then wood would be stacked everywhere, anywhere it could fit, waiting to be shipped out. The piers themselves were not gloriously beautiful. They were not OSHA certified. You see here, this is an early pier in Bailey's Harbor, established by Moses Kilgore. and very rough decking, no side rails. You just imagine horses, pulling very, very heavy loads back and forth, in the wind and the rain on these things. And accidents did happen from time to time. If the lake bottom was sandy or silty, the builders favored pile construction. So this is Volk's Pier in Kewanee, and you can see the pilings supporting the decking. You also notice a couple of schooners out there loading. And when you dive these sites, you see the stumps of the pilings, at various heights, kind of protruding from the sand. There's a fallen one as well at this site. This is the Whitefish Bay Piers, the furthest north pile pier that we've documented to date. Most of Door County has bedrock in the bays and along the shoreline. So you're not going to drive wooden piling into this. So the builders favored another type of pier construction. It was crib piering. So again, here's a side view of the first pier that I showed you in Bailey's Harbor, Kilgore's Pier. And you'll notice instead of pilings coming down, you have these big blocky cribs supporting the pier itself. And also note, there's a pile of lumber on this one, stacked up, ready to be loaded onto that schooner that's come to call. So cribs are built kind of like log cabins. So they're notched together in various ways, some secured with iron drift pins, and then filled up with stone to weigh them down. So here's a bunch of crib fill that never got shipped out at Toft Point. And these would be built up on the ice, as you see this Luxembourger Pier Company photo from Ronksville. And the idea is you build it up on the lake ice and you wait for the sun to warm up that timber just enough that it melts through and drops to the bottom, and hope that you have estimated the depth of the lake accurately at this point and that you haven't submerged the whole thing under the water. You want some to stick up so you can keep building and then make the deck as level as you can. Well, this is what they're after. Timber. Again, white pine is favored for lumber. Cedar made good fence posts and shingles and railroad ties. Hemlock was also harvested for ties, but mainly for tanning bark. The bark's highly in demand in Milwaukee and Sheboygan, where the big tanneries were. Hardwoods are cut into cordwood for fuel. And over the next decades, Wisconsin's coastal forests are basically shipped south acre by acre from these little ports. The life of a pier community is very seasonal, all about when heavy goods could be moved the easiest. So logging starts after the fall harvest is over and young men are free to come work. You want that snow on the ground. It made the living conditions a little difficult, of course. You've got frostbite. It's sort of miserable. As colder it gets, the worse it gets. But you need the snow and the ice again to move the goods. So you want to set up ice roads because most of the stuff is being hauled by sled or sledge. And the newspapers are just full of, when is it going to snow? Is it going to be the right kind of snow? Finally, we've got enough snow. The hauling season has started. And then it's just account after account. If so many move this much pine, they compete with each other. How much can a single load, carry? The Teamsters want to be the ones that set those records. They're brought to little sawmills. These are not fabulous facilities. They're basically sheds with some steam or water power equipment inside. As this is a surviving example at Lily Bay at Door County. You can see it right next to the boat launch. Okay. And the amount of wood that is produced is just almost unbelievable. So here's a photo of the pier yards at Jacksonport, where three separate lumber piers run by competitors are side by side at that little community. And they talk about, they would run out of room. Sawdust would cover everything. People worried about fire all the time. And some piers did burn to the ground. In the spring, when the lake ice thawed, schooners would start coming to call, the lumber carriers. This is the schooner Sardinia. Here she is at port here in one of the big cities. I'm not sure if this is Chicago or Milwaukee or Detroit. But you see all the stacked dimension lumber next to the carrier that has been unloaded, ship after ship after ship, heading south, dropping off their goods and then turning right around and heading north to pick up more. Again, not everyone made it. Ships loading and unloading at the piers were extremely vulnerable. So if a storm or gale came up and surprise them there, they tended to bounce on the bottom or they would bang into the pier. The captains would try and cast off and get them away as fast as they could, but sometimes they weren't fast enough, or in the case of the Otter, the steering mechanism failed at just the worst time and the waves pushed it right onto shore. So all the men from the Otter actually got off. They shot some life-saving lines with guns across the ship and were able to haul the men off through the surf in this. The cutover lands could then be sold to farmers, incoming colonists, and immigrants. In some cases, they would buy forested parcels of their own and then could sell the wood at the pier complexes. They'd bring it in as loads of their own and then negotiate, okay, well, we'll take cash or we'll trade it for goods in the store, maybe for some store credit. But it was hard in these areas to farm because the stumps are the problem, the cutover land. So stump pulling and stump dynamiting, you know, the time it took and the effort is amazing. And if you read the histories, people talk about the Great Peshtigo Fire in this area of 1871 as this massive tragedy, and it was a horrible loss of life and absolutely devastating. And as I'm doing the research, I hit the 10-year mark and they begin to commemorate the anniversary, and I was really surprised to say, well, yeah, that was bad. But those same newspapers 10 years later are saying it was bad, but it was also the best thing to happen to us because it burned the stumps away and it made the land easier to till and easier to convert to farm. All right, so with some generous assistance from Wisconsin's Coastal Management Program, the Wisconsin Historical Society has undertaken an investigation of 18 of these little rural ports to date. So 8 in Fort Door County, 4 ports in Kewaunee County, 3 in Manitowoc County, 2 in Sheboygan County, and 1 in Washington County, and that's Ronksville. So the sample is in addition to maritime work at Jacksonport undertaken by our staff some years ago, and some supplementary maritime work at rural pier ports in Claybanks Township, the southeast portion of the county, by the Wisconsin Underwater Archaeology Association. And those are the ones in gray. Again, this is not remotely everything in Door County. These are just the ones we have visited and managed to relocate. Okay. So some of the pier ruins are quite impressive. In Door County specifically, many of these are on public land, so they can be visited. So I'm going to start just south of Door County, however, to kind of do a compare and contrast. We're going to jump just over the line in Kewaunee County, just south of Kewaunee itself, and talk about a very successful pier community. So what does it take to really make a living doing this? Well, you need to be forward thinking. You need to think strategically, and you need to have very, very good luck. So Dean's Pier, later known as Carlton's, founded in 1854, right after the Treaty of Wolf River opens the area up for colonization, and is passed from the founders into a set of intermingled and intermarried Bohemian immigrant families. The Bachs, dish makers, and Kiwigs. And you see some of the individuals down here at the bottom. And Ed Bach at the far left really kind of set the pattern. He was way ahead of his time. He was a lumberman, but he loved farming and he realized the trees were not going to last forever. So he ensured that the company, known as Taylor and Bach, when he's beginning his career with them, he made sure that they had a very large support farm, and many of these little complexes did because they needed a place to grow oats and grain for the horses and vegetables for themselves and for the workers. You got to have cabbage. You want a little hay. He turned this farm into an absolute showpiece. The latest crops, the best agricultural implements. He had lectures at the general store about how to be, the best farmer. He published in the newspaper saying, hey guys, lumbermen, think ahead. The trees are not going to grow as fast as we are taking them out, which means that this money that we're making through this import-export is going to end, and we have to figure out what's next. So why don't we think about agriculture? And then he had just an absolute brilliant idea. He thought, why not do something even better than growing wheat? Maybe, just maybe, Wisconsin might be able to make some money making cheese. So he opened the first cheese factory in Kewaunee County, and Kewaunee County becomes a dairy county because of Ed Bach. So it spreads out from this tiny little, now completely unknown, vanished community and affects the course of the regional economy. Inside the Pierce store, he's also focusing on the Pierce store. So the interior of the general store at Dean's Pier in Carlton, you see almost everything you want to buy is here. There's horse tack and blankets and molasses casks and boots and shoes and bonnets and dresses and axes and anything you would need kind of stuffed in there. Between the cheese factory and the proceeds from this store, the families together managed to raise enough money to buy most of a square block in downtown Kewaunee and put up a multi-story brick department store, partnered with a local merchant. So refashioned as Bach, Kewig, and Poser Company. And it became a generational business. When they moved to Kewaunee to take care of this business, they were most of the population of Carlton, so Carlton actually succeeds itself to death. So comparing it, however, we're going to jump now. We're in Door County, just over the county line. A little place called Foscaro. And Foscaro is the evil twin. This is what not to do. So Captain Fellows sets up a sawmill there. He decided to go with water power instead of steam. He set up a little shipyard of his own. And at first you think he had everything going for him. It was a wonderful location. He had all the good timber he needed. And then bad decision after bad decision after bad decision, and some worse luck of any of these pier owners. This is a very, very brief list of the things went wrong. I'm going to just call it a handful of them here. So he bought the complex in 1872, not long after the Great Peshtigo Fire, and just as the national economy collapsed. He almost lost everything right then. 1878, his son Fred lost some toes in the sawmill. There was a murder at the adjacent tavern. 1881, the pier is destroyed by ice. 1883, the pier is destroyed by ice. There's an attempted murder in the tavern. 1885, the pier is destroyed by ice. 1886, the pier is destroyed by ice. In 1890, there's an outbreak of typhoid. 1893, his son Frank died in a hay wagon accident. His brand new ship sank on the day it was launched. And his son, there was an actual, not kidding, plague of grasshoppers that year. It's not quite locusts, but close. 1901, his house burned to the ground in a 4th of July firecracker accident. And then 1906, the blacksmith dies in an accidental shooting that's from a horror movie. That's just a little bit of what went wrong. He just never was able to adapt to the fact that cutting the forest was changing the environment. It was causing water tables to drop. He couldn't run his mill. He never converted to steam. He never thought ahead about what he should do next. And he winds up dying broke, essentially completely bankrupt near the end. So heading north, we're going to go all the way now to the tip of Door County. So in the summer of 2023, we did visit some of these pier sites. So I'm going to go through the results of some of our excavations. We'll start with Newport, now Newport State Park, a dark sky park. Established in 1881 by immigrant Hans Johnson, who set up the pier and the usual complex buildings, including the general store. He partners a little bit later on with an individual named Peter Knudsen. And the partnership had a kind of a shaky start. So the local lore holds that Knudsen was actually manning a lighthouse up on Washington Island and left his life savings with Johnson through the summer months, intending to return in the winter when the lighthouse would be shut down, because of course there's no lake traffic. And when he got back, he found that Johnson had drank his life savings away. And so in return, since he couldn't get the money back, Johnson gave him a good portion of Newport in exchange. So Johnson kind of sells out, Knudsen takes the place over and makes it a going concern for quite a while. So here is a historic photo of Newport as it was at its heyday. Again, you're standing at the edge of the pier in this photograph. You can see a worker, again, very rough, uneven decking. no rails. You see the complex on shore. You're looking towards the general store just to the left of the base of the pier and the post office. There's a sawmill out of frame to the right. There's boarding houses and other sport buildings to the left. And if you go to this exact place today, and here they are marked, see all the lumber stored everywhere. If you go to the same place today, not a thing left. So that photograph is taken from the same vantage point, and it's just now a swimming beach for the tourists that visit Newport. There's a little historic kiosk in that grassy field with some historic photos kind of commemorating the little town that used to be there. Some photos. So again, there's the store and the post office. You see more lumber being sort of stored, stacked around it with support buildings in the background. The sawmill. Again, these aren't fancy mills, just basically just enough of a cover to keep the equipment out of the snow and the rain. They could be very miserable. There are accounts of people getting frostbite in these mills or passing out in heat waves. A detail of the pier, you've got some horses. They're kind of cooling off their feet after hauling some heavy loads out onto the pier. And there's a steamer pulled up. And again, you see all the lumber and forest products stacked up at the end, waiting to be loaded. Now, Knudsen tried to keep things going. He had grand visions. Unfortunately, like most ports, once the timber was gone, there was no real reason to keep running the mill. The mill shuts down. Now there's not much employment since they start leaving, heading for greener pastures elsewhere. And the population begins to shrink, and it's sort of the death spiral for most of the ports in Door County. But Knudsen heard a rumor that the railroad was coming. Now, in the southern part of the state, the railroad meant death to these little communities because they could not compete with it. You can ship your grain via railroad year-round, whereas you have to wait for the lake ice to go out on the lake, and ships sink. Locomotives don't normally sink. So they just outcompete the little communities. But Door County, the railroad actually held promise for continuing life. And Knudsen platted out this town. It would be the village of Newport, and you see the pier circled there. This town never existed. It remained on paper. The railroad actually never made its way that far north in Door County, so the dream dies. And he gets sort of saddled with the property until a retired jeweler from the Chicago area, moves north and kind of buys it from him as charity, the Holtz family. They wind up being the biggest landowner in Door County, is buying up all these properties to kind of rescue some of the folks who wound up with used up timberland, to kind of get them out from poverty and give them a break and let them go on to other things. If you go to the pier now, however, it's just offshore. So some of the cribbing is still there. You can kayak out and look. Some of the nearest crib to shore you can walk out to if the lake levels are shallow enough. Okay. Beautiful cribbing out there. So if you're a recreational diver, I recommend going and checking these things out too. Okay. You see this, the stone crib fills kind of spilling out on this one as it collapses. You know, the fish hang out next to them. Some of the iron drift pins still there. You see some of the fastening on this one. And this particular crib is shallow enough that our divers were able to document it just sort of by bobbing around on the surface with snorkels and taking notes. So onshore, so after the Holtz family buys it, they turn it into a farmstead for a little while. And you see the former post office and general store there at the far left. That got turned into a farmhouse for a bit, and lovely Model Ts sitting out front. An aerial view, you see the remains of the cribs for the pier out there, and you see, on shore there's the farmhouse. One of the buildings has been turned into a barn, and there's a little vegetable garden next door. So that is where that grassy field is today. So we're going to jump south a little bit to Rowley's Bay now. 1876 to 1902, like a similar lifespan. Okay. That one was founded by the lumber dealership of Osborne Cogswell Incorporated of Racine in the 1860s initially, but never really got going until S.A. Rogers, the New York Yankee, brings the complex to life in 1876. and then expands his land holdings around the bay. He actually built multiple piers around Rowley's Bay to kind of feed timber into the main pier next to the complex. Little settlement had a storehousing, doctor's office, which his father-in-law was a doctor, so making the wife happy, and then a post office. The community also had a sawmill, uh, farm complex, their ice house, and their own school. The community went into decline when local supply of wood was logged out, as you would imagine, and Rogers wound up returning to New York, leaving his heirs in charge. And in 1948, the family sells out to, it's kind of a pattern for Door County, Lou Casagrande, who's a diamond dealer. So we have another jeweler, in this case from Milwaukee. And Casagrande establishes a little tourist resort near the complex, but not on it. So here is a historic plat map of the Rowley's Bay Pier, and you can see the marking for the post office and store and sawmill there. Rogers specialized in shingles, very high quality shingles. So this example was hung on the walls of the Rowley's Bay Resort. So anyone that visited might have actually seen this piece there. So 6-inch clear, showing that it's a very good shingle. Aerial photograph after the complex has kind of died away, and you can see the ruins of the foundation left where the store and post office had been, some cribbing scattered around. There's a little small dock for fishing boats that's been established nearby. And this is sort of before the tourist complex comes in, but after the lumber complex is gone. And again, it turns into a little farmstead for a while in the middle part of its career. The sawmill, again, just a shed with a couple smokestacks so it doesn't catch on fire, and just enough to keep the workers dry and out of the weather. If you go there today, there's not much left of the dock. Unfortunately, when they dredged a channel for the current fishing dock and pier, they blasted right through the remains of the original lumber pier. So the cribbing has been knocked loose and is sort of rolling around on the floor of Rowley's Bay. You can dive down or wade out and find bits of it and see some of the attachment points there and notching. Well, we were interested when we were looking at Rowley's Bay. We were hoping to find the pier. Kind of sad to find it in pieces. But we were also looking for a ship. I mentioned that ships tended to go down at these piers, and we had reports of a schooner known as the Emma Layton having gone down at the Rowley's Bay Pier. Okay. Specifically at a place called Porth's Pier. It didn't really make much sense to us. There was already something kind of wrong with these accounts because Rogers owned the pier here, and we would have thought, okay, it's Rogers Pier or it's Rowley's Bay Pier. But the accounts keep saying Porth's Pier at Rowley's Bay. And like, okay, Rogers had multiple piers. Maybe it's one of those. But people had searched and searched and searched Rowley's Bay over the years looking for this schooner and not finding a trace of the wreck. Here's an ad for Porth's Pier, the same kind of business model, and it says Rowley's Bay, Wisconsin. Okay, all right, well, what's going on? Here's an account of the sinking. So Master George C. Thompson of Milwaukee made short work of the Rowley Bay Pier when he smashed his vessel into it while attempting to dock. Helped by a strong east-northeast wind, the schooner quickly dislodged 7 massive cribs. Remember, these are full of stone. So that was a hard hit. Unlike the poor schooner, which ended her service that fateful day, the pier was repaired. The next port south solved the mystery for it. So Appleport. We're going to head south of Rowley's Bay. And it turns out the answer was hiding in plain sight, right in the name of this little ghost port itself. Appleport was not a port that exported apples. It was a port owned by 2 individuals named Apple and Porth. So the name got a little corrupted. So Porth's Pier becomes Appleport over the years. Okay. Porth's Pier wasn't exactly at Rowley's Bay. It was south of it. So they were using Rowley's Bay as a landmark. So this map shows Appleport in relationship to the Rowley's Bay Resort. Usual kind of commerce, usual kind of pier. We had a landowner that was kind enough to give us a copy of this photo. So here's a picture of, again, from the water's edge, you're looking out at Appleport in its very last years when it had become a fishing community. And you see that this little tiny fish shack has been built on the remains of one of the original lumber pier cribs. And there's another original crib kind of supporting the very rickety little gangplank out to the fish shack. Survey found kind of a mess when we got out there. This is extremely shallow. It's been scoured by storms and ice a lot. There are the remains of these little fish shanty cribs kind of intermingled with the original line of the lumber pier. And as we walked out onto the beach and we set up our transit, we had divers in the water. One landowner comes down and she said, "Oh, you're here with the historical sighting." And yeah. And we expect that we would talk about the piers. And she says, "Are you here for the ship?" And like, "What ship?" She says, "Well, if you walk this particular direction out so far on that line, you're going to come across a ship." Like, "Oh, tell us more." So we did. So waded out because it's very shallow. So while the divers are working the pier, those of us on shore went running out into the water, and in very short order came across the remnants of a schooner. And so this is the centerboard for a lumber schooner. In fact, it's the Emma Layton. So finally found in the right place. So it has broken into pieces, as you might imagine, in the shallow water, and after going through 7 stone cribs. It's not exactly intact anymore. There are fittings from it kind of strewn around the bottom as well. As we were looking around the debris field, this item popped up and immediately caught the attention of one of our volunteers who is a steam engine aficionado. And he got very excited about this. This appears to be a piston from a small portable steam engine, the kind that would be used to run, maybe, a sawmill, but also possibly a piece of farm equipment. This could have been used for like a little steam-powered harvester or thresher as well. So not quite sure what it's doing in the lake, but there it is. So that kind of solved the mystery of the Emma Layton. So we're going to jump south again to Toft Point Natural Area, just outside of Bailey's Harbor, just kind of around the corner. Toft Point was the location of the Mud Bay Limestone Quarry, so not a lumber port, but it does have a lumber history, interestingly enough. The Toft family were conservationists well ahead of their time, and they only took down as many live trees as they needed to operate the quarry. They refused to log the rest of their land. It caused no end of grief. The neighbors, including Kilgore from Bailey's Harbor, they wanted that timber so bad, constantly trying to move the property boundaries in and poach. The Toft family were tangled up in lawsuits that went on for decades. The parcel became known as the Fighting 40 because people fought over the timber on it so hard and for so long. And in the meantime, the Toft family went about exporting stone instead of timber. So they set up a quarry. They built a very sturdy pier and dock platform out into the lake. They built their own little lime kiln to try and render some of this down into lime. The kiln didn't work real well, according to the family descendants. They only got it used a couple of times. They had to have, of course, housing for workers, so they built this lovely boarding house where workers that didn't have families would live in this. The ones that did have families would build little cabins of their own just outside the quarry itself and kind of near the lake shore where they had a better view. When Thomas Toft passes away in the early 1900s from a stroke, and the family attributes the stroke to the stress of fighting these lawsuits over the timber. When he goes, the family wants to keep this parcel because it is possibly one of the prettiest places in Wisconsin. It is pristine. They wanted to make sure that nothing happened to it. So they had this idea, like, okay, what if we turn to a renewable resource? Carlton tried cheese. The Toft family had an even better idea. They said, there's no shortage of people from Chicago. Let's go and harvest tourists. So they turn this boarding house into a lodge and start building a bunch of little cabins, very rustic little cabins around the complex, and they run the Toft Point Resort for decades. Okay. So when you go there today, again, this is a natural area. It can be visited by the public. The boarding house slash lodge is there in ruined form. You can wander around the foundation. The flagpole behind it, I'm sad to say, fell about a month or two after that photograph was taken. So the flagpole's laying on the ground now. You can take the trail in and visit the quarry itself. So you can see that the wall is still standing there with new pine regrowing in on top. Here's the lime kiln right next to the trail. There are stacks of stone still there, waiting to be shipped, and some are, let's see if I can get this to work, quite large. This is known as the big stack. So think about these being quarried and lifted by hand, one after another, stacked into this, waiting to be loaded onto hand carts and trundled down to that little dock on the beach to be put on schooners, and just didn't happen. So these are some of the last bits to be quarried there. Oops. Along the shoreline, again, tons of spoil from the quarry, more stone that never got shipped out to be burned down to lime or used for crib fill. And then the dock is impressive enough. You can actually see it in Google Earth imagery if you know what you're looking for on the east side of the point. And that dock is the location of the wreck associated with this pier. So just around the corner and along the dock itself is the schooner Ebenezer. Went down in the Great Alpino Blow. The family lore holds that the captain tied up, loaded with stone. So again, you have a wooden schooner filled with rocks next to a pier built out of rocks. The captain left the cook in charge and went into Bailey's Harbor to take on more crew, and this is when the storm blows up. The cook panics, he lets out too much anchor chain, and the schooner begins to smash into the quarry dock itself, and of course busts into pieces and goes down. So when the captain gets back, this is the sight he's greeted with, what's left of his schooner laying on its side, filling up with water in the bay. Is broken up further now, so if you scuba dive and kayak around, you'll find pieces of the schooner laying around. Elsewhere on the property, you find the remains of the resort. So the ice house is still in the middle of the woods, okay, and tourist cabins that look as if people could come out and stretch and head out onto the lake, maybe not in that canoe, head out to the lake to get some fresh fish and bring it in for Emma Toft to fry up at the lodge. So it's a little place that's almost frozen in time, and because it contains some of the last truly virgin timber in Door County, the walk in and out through the Fighting 40 is, everyone should do it. Again, I can't emphasize enough how beautiful this place is. Okay, we will kind of wrap up at the we'll head back north again at the far northern tip at Death's Door Passage to Hedgehog Harbor near Gills Rock. There were a number of pier sites set up in the harbor. It was kind of a crowded little place. Some were shipping lumber, some were shipping stone from another quarry up there. You see here 3 piers in Hedgehog Harbor, 2 more at Garrett's Bay right next door. And as you might imagine, having that many young men that far from settlements, cooped up over the winter and doing hard labor, things would sometimes get a little out of hand. So we found a newspaper article, okay, a series of them, with the saga of William Mullock of Hedgehog Harbor, who got in a little bit of trouble. So I'll call out this one. I'll read it for those of you that can't read on your screen. A mob of 60 men went in the night to tar and feather William Mullock at Hedgehog Harbor, Wisconsin. They put the tar into a kettle in his dooryard and built a fire to melt it. They tore open a pillow, which they had brought along, and arranged the feathers ready for use. Then they threw some stones through the windows to awaken Mullock. He coolly appears at the door with an axe across his shoulder and says, "All right, boys, I'm ready whenever you are. Walk up and take me. But you'll have to spare the first that comes, because he'll get a bullet right through his head." The crowd dispersed without applying the tar. The residents of Hedgehog Harbor wound up chasing Mullock over half of Door County. He just did not want to leave and give up the lumbering jobs that area had to offer, but he also wasn't welcome either. He actually went to Newport for a little bit, took a job there, and then the mob walks overland through the window and starts throwing stuff at the boarding house where he's staying to try and drive him out of there as well. And as the stories go, the whole thing is started by the fact that he had an affair with the wife of another one of the workers in the complex. That's what kind of set everything off. So some of the men here is next door at Garrett Bay at the stone quarry. And again, here's one of the little piers, slightly smaller piers here, because you don't have to go out quite as far to hit deeper water, and there's a little steamer pulled up to load stone. Okay. Again, because this is Death Store Passage, very notorious for storms blowing up fast, there are a few shipwrecks in this harbor associated with the various piers, and they've kind of broken up and intermingled with one another. And the water here can be crystal clear in the summer. It's just beautiful. You'd think you were in the Gulf of Mexico. So again, a perfect place. You can launch out at Gills Rock in the background at the boat launch there and kayak or snorkel or swim over here and kind of take a look at these wreck remains. So here's a kind of photogrammetry model that was put together. This is the intermingled remains of the Sardinia, that first lumber schooner I showed you. This is where it winds up, and the Maria. And they both in separate storms get caught at piers, loading and loading, and get washed to the shoreline before they can get away and break apart. And if you go there today, so that white building where you can get a Coke, that's the pier store. So that's Weborg's Pier. So one of the few surviving, still functioning pier stores in Wisconsin. And if you head around under the Green Bay side, you can visit the pier store for Ephraim, as an Anderson's store. This is now hosting the Ephraim Historical Society, and you can walk out onto their dock, which survives, and visit this warehouse. It's very colorful. This is not vandalism graffiti. It has become tradition if you get engaged or married to write your names on the warehouse. So kind of romantic place. So I will wrap up with one last pier community of it, Booze Point. This is across the bay from Toft Point. We did not find, I'm sad to say, any remains of the original pier at this location, but I do want to end with it because we talk about ghost ports at this location. And local lore holds it that this little lumbering community was abandoned not because they ran out of trees, but because it was haunted. They spotted ghosts and lights and phantom teamsters in the woods, and everyone decided to pack up one night and just leave and find employment someplace else. So after folks went away, of course, the lake ice takes its toll. These piers degrade and fall into the water. Okay. And so now they're archaeological, and I really do encourage people to try and find these locations. So we have added all the information that we found on these pier sites to wisconsinshipwrecks.org, so you can see our photos and maps. We have a report that is going to be published early spring. It'll show up on wisconsinshipwrecks.org as well. You can find our Kewaunee County report, which is complete at that website in the research area. And you can also investigate these sites through Wisconsin's Lake Michigan water trails, which you find on the DNR website. We're making sure they have our data as well. And with that, lots of thanks to lots of people, especially including the Wisconsin Coastal Management Program and NOAA that helped fund our research. So I will stop sharing screen here, and if I can get the cursor over there and open it up to questions. So thank you all.
Thanks, Amy. That was a great presentation. I enjoyed it a lot.
Yes.
And we do have some questions in the chat
Okay.
here.
All right, a little drink if you don't mind that.
Absolutely. Don's got a few questions here. I'll shoot them over one at a time.
Okay.
He's asking about the owners of the schooners and the other ships that moved lumber to the piers. He's wondering if they were locally owned or if they were owned by businessmen from larger cities such as Milwaukee and Chicago.
It was a combination. So some of the pier communities did try and own their own ship. So Ronksville had the Northerner. Carlton had a number of ships. Captain Fellows tried to build his own. He had a absolutely cursed little schooner called the Sea Star. So many of these places would try and get a ship if they could. If they couldn't, they would do yearly contracts. So you will see in the newspaper articles, sometimes the same ship making trip after trip after trip north, back and forth, and then the next year another ship sometimes would take over the rounds. Those ships tended to be owned by either independent outfitters or by the businesses in Chicago and Milwaukee.
Okay.
At Carlton, one of the things they did right is they made sure that they had staff on site and an office in Chicago next to the lumber trading floor and the lumber yards, so they could kind of keep an eye on both sides. Okay.
Okay. And his next follow-up question was, what might be the best resource to locate the records of shipping prior to 1900?
1900, I honestly think the newspapers. They're
Okay.
fascinating. So if you look at the marine reports for the Chicago papers, for the Milwaukee papers, you will often find a little tabulation during the shipping season. There's every week or every day. Here are the ships that landed. This is what they're bringing. Here are the ships that are leaving. This is what they're carrying north. And just newspaper after newspaper, you can find them in the local, so like little local columns. People will say, "Oh, you know, I was at such and such, and these schooners landed, and this is what they picked up," and go off. And plus, it's just as fun as can be to read those old newspapers anyway. So Door County and Kewaunee County are both online. If you
Okay.
go to the library pages, you can find those papers completely scanned and just read through them.
Oh, neat. Very cool. And then his last question he asks, is there an archive for shipping records, or are most reports dependent on existing news accounts? And I guess you kind of talked about that a little bit, but
News, mostly newspapers. Yeah, it is speak about. We have volunteers that are trying to put together, you know, a comprehensive list, and I hope someday to have every single one of these accounts tabulated, because I would love to do a little, you know, animation where you see the ships, you
oh,
know,
that'd be
in
really
real
neat.
time going back and forth. That'd be awesome.
Very, very cool. Then we have a question here from Tom. He says, I assume Ronks were immigrants from Luxembourg. Do we know much about their immigration story?
That they came from Luxembourg. Yeah, that is it. So yeah, very much that story. We don't know that much specifically about them. I came with their families, and you see the same thing again all up and down the coast. The box of the Kiwigs, the dishmakers come to mind again from Carlton, because I'm writing actually a National Register of Historic Places nomination for that pier site, so they're very fresh. Uh, it could be rough. Most of the immigrants would come into Milwaukee and stay there for a year or two to kind of climatize. And you know, they're going through newspapers like, where should we go? And then you hear, okay, there's land for sale to the north. We have an account of a Norwegian immigrant for a little place called Sprague's Pier, also in Kewaunee County. And he actually wrote an account of what it was like to come up and sight unseen to buy a parcel. And he was appalled to find that it was covered in timber. He had no idea what to
Well,
make of it. He's used to nice, open, ready-made farmland, and he thought he'd been swindled and he was, you know, his life was over. And he
sure.
was about to sell out, and another immigrant said, "Are you nuts? You know, that your whole parcel, 40 acres, is covered in cedar. Hey, you can sell this for a lot of money." And he's, "Oh, yeah." You know. So it was a culture shock for some of these folks, but they settled in.
Okay. And then Tom also asked, what was the limestone used for?
Limestone building,
Okay.
uh, rendering down into lime. The Tops Point lime was actually, their stone was very well regarded for making good lime. It was shipped mostly to Manistee to be rendered down. And then, as I said, crib construction. So they would break it up and they were hauling it to make cribs. They were using it for jetties for some of the big harbors like Manitowoc, Sheboygan. It would be going to construction of the harbor facilities as well.
Okay. And Tom's last question was one that I had too. What regulations protect the shipwrecks? And my add-on to that would be, are the piers and those structures covered in that?
Yeah. So cultural resources that are on Wisconsin bottomland, so anything below the usual high water mark is considered state land. So any cultural resources on or embedded in the bottomland, they are protected by law. In other
Okay.
words, if you see something in the water, tell us about it, but don't take it out of the water.
Okay, perfect. And I think that's the only questions that we had. Sam said great new info. Thanks. And that's all we have in the chat right now.
Okay, awesome. Okay, so thank you all very much.
I do see something in the Q&A.
Okay.
Tom says, rule of thumb, did bigger diameter crib logs and larger crib rocks resist lake ice longer?
That I do not know. You know, it was very interesting going through the cribs on this study. They were very varied. You know, each builder had their own way of putting things together. Okay. The cribs at Newport, they are very solid, very sturdy cribs. and they're in decent shape. You get down to just south of Bailey's Harbor, there's a little pier community called Higgins Pier. The person that did that was very obviously a cabinetry person, because some of the wildest, most intricate joining I've ever seen, dovetails and all this, decent shape, but smaller diameter. And then others, yeah, Rowley's, it's hard to say. It was smaller diameter. They were obviously using a drift pin method, and that just blew apart, when the dredger hit it. So
Was there a difference, a discernible difference maybe in perhaps where the immigrants came from? Like, I know a lot of people that look into like some of the stuff in the UP, they say, well, the Finlanders built things this way, and that sort of thing. Was there
we have
anything
it,
like that, or?
unfortunately, not a big enough sample to really tell.
Okay.
I honestly do think it comes down, in with the case of the piers, to individuals. And we know with the pile piers, there are certain, because for a pile pier, you need a steam pile driver. So in that case, you had folks that would specialize in pier reports. They say, I have a steam driver. You can hire me to come up and fix your pier when the ice knocks into it or ship bumps into it. So there's a little less variation in that. But I'm wondering with the cribs, is it just the person involved?
Gotcha. Okay. Then we just had Cindy said thank you, Amy, very interesting. And then we had a couple
Hi, Cindy.
people asking whether the presentation will be archived, and yes, it will. It will be available for everyone to view later. And I guess with that, I will send it back to Tom or Don, whoever would like to take it over.
Okay, Amy.
Okay.
Go ahead.
All right. I just want to say it was a very interesting, fascinating subject and thoroughly enjoyable. So for tonight, thank you for another great presentation. I'm sure that everyone that participated tonight enjoyed the information, and we hope that everyone learned from what you had to share tonight. For the participants, I hope you know that your participation is important to the success of our webinar series. With that in mind, there's a reminder here that at the end of tonight's presentation, as you start to close out, you'll receive a short 8-question survey. We'd appreciate it greatly if you just take a couple moments to fill that in and provide that feedback to us. Our next webinar will be coming up probably in February. We haven't got anything lined up for January yet, so we'll probably not have a January webinar, but we will get it, once we have it arranged, we will get that posted to our website and our Facebook page right away, and we'll also send out a note to those who attend the webinars on a regular basis. So again, thank you everyone for a great presentation. I thank you, Amy, for a great presentation. Thank you all for joining us, and I wish you all the best holiday season here in the next couple of weeks. So thank you much.
Thank you all.